here today representing HIPPO, Health Policy, Politics and Organisation Research Group. I'm sure you've been aware of the other sessions that have been going on over the last few weeks. So at the end of the presentation, we're all looking at different aspects of the types of research methods that we use and the analysis that we carry out. So I will, right at the end, remind you of all the upcoming sessions in terms of the analysis. Today I want to not really talk about the theoretical aspects of observational research, because I think if you read books and the literature, there's quite a lot of out there surrounding why you should carry out observations and in what way they're useful. But I want to provide you with some of my experiences from when I was carrying out my PhD, and I'm happy to have any discussions or questions throughout. So let's get started. So in terms of the presentation, I want to just give a brief summary of observations in general, what types of observations you can use, the historical origins of observations, and the big question of why use observations, how are they useful in terms of your research project. And I won't spend that much time on those areas of the presentation, but really what I want to try and go into some more detail is how does it work. So my practical experiences of things that, these might not necessarily be the right way, but how I carried out observations, and my top tips for you if you've not done them before, or if you think you're struggling whilst you're out there in the field. And then I'll provide you with some examples of the data that I got from my PhD, showing different aspects of how I use my observation data and how I presented it within my thesis, and then just provide you some of the further information of the upcoming sessions. So in terms of observations themselves, if you look in the literature, in books, actually there's many different ways to describe observations, and I think what's important is to try and understand what do you want out of that type of methodology in terms of how you use observations and what useful they be to your research project. So as health policy researchers, we're wanting to try and understand what's happening in practice, so in terms of understanding how central government are producing such wide documents, how they're being interpreted and enacted locally within the health setting, and try and understand organisational and individual perceptions that are happening on the ground within that natural setting and context. I had never used observations before I started my PhD, so I really do feel like I'm no expert here. But what I did find from using them, it's a big part of our team's work, is that actually they really did generate some really rich data, and I think it really made my thesis and my research project stronger for having that, which is why I decided that this would be the topic I spoke about today. So in terms of observation, I'm sure if you've read anything about it, you've seen all different types. So people can describe observations as something that's quantitative, qualitative, so it can be exploratory, it can be more of I've read in books about checklist approach, so are you looking for a specific thing for your topic and are you checking it off and seeing what's happening in practice? You can be involved with the observation as a participant, so you can be in a particular context. So for example, for me, I focused on clinical commissioning groups, CCGs. I could have been an active part of that observation, which would make me a participant within that setting, or the actual methods that we use tend to focus on non-participant observation. So I went out and was observing meetings and sitting there but not being directly involved with the meeting. I'll talk a little bit more about non-participant observations and the loose terms surrounding that really, and how you can get drawn into meetings, but that's normally the preferred method I choose. In terms of covert and overt, there's also the question when carrying out observations of, do you want people to know why you're there, in terms of if they're aware of your research project or why you're observing them, do you think that'll impact upon the type of data that you get from the observation? So again, it's the question, I'm sure, in terms of we carry out overt observations, people know why we're there, what we're looking at, but in terms of, there's been lots of documentaries in the past in terms of like football hooliganism, where people have gone into that setting to try and understand it further, and to really get the information they thought they needed, they had to really hide who they were to be part of that natural setting. So these are just things to think about in terms of observations as a whole. So in terms of the context of the method, qualitative observations are often referred to as ethnography. And this is derived from anthropology, and it's based on the need of the investigator to understand the symbolic world of a specific group of interest in their natural setting. So again, in terms of observations within the workplace, what I'm talking about today, it's defining what that natural setting is in terms of the organisation you're looking at. So in terms of Hippo, we're very much healthcare based, and I will keep going back to that because that's basically my bread and butter and my experience. But these types of research methods can be used in other settings such as education, private sector. So it's defining what that natural setting is of where you want to carry out your observations. So why use observational research methods? And this slide, I've taken the top 3 points from Mason and the references at the back of my presentation, who argues that there could be a number of reasons why you carry out observational research, and it can help inform your projects. Observations themselves allow the researcher to immerse themselves within the actual research setting. You can not only observe the setting, but you're observing individuals within that setting, within that organisation. You can observe relationships and interactions between people to see how the dynamic or how people work together within a specific context. So in terms of ontology, you could have an ontological perspective where actually interactions, actions, and the way that people interpret and act together on these behaviours may be central to your type of research method or what you're investigating. You might have an epistemological position where knowledge or evidence from a specific social world can be generated by observing and participating within that natural research setting. Or you might just decide that actually the type of data you require in terms of your field work or what you're looking into requires something more than an interview, in the sense that you need to see individuals working together within their natural context to get the right data in terms of your research questions. And within Hippo, we follow a multi-methods approach. So we actually use a number of different qualitative research methods in parallel, so at once. And we find that that's quite a useful way to use observations because it provides you with lots of different types of data and a fuller picture really of what's happening within the organisation that you're researching. So, for example, for my PhD, I looked at clinical commissioning groups and I carried out observations alongside interviews, and I also collected relevant documents that I thought were relevant to my research project. So, I managed to use a number of different methods, but alongside deciding to do that, you also have to think about the amount of data that will generate. Qualitative is that in depth, it produces a massive amount of data, so it's something when you're designing a research project to think about how are you going to handle that data from different sources, and also how are you going to utilise it and use it alongside each other when you're presenting your findings. So just things right at the beginning to be thinking about, and also it's iterative. You've got to think about that whilst you're out in the field as well, using those different types of methodologies. So in terms of non-participant observations, this is when the researcher does not participate within the situation. And I've just got some quotes here from different people who talk about the strengths of carrying out non-participant observations. So Green and Thorogood argue that observational methods allow researchers to record features of everyday life that informants did not feel relevant to disclose in interviews. And this is something that actually I find really useful and from my PhD. So people will tell you particular things. Maybe that's because that they think that's what you want to hear, or because they know what your research project is, so they're just going to talk about that. But actually, by using observations alongside interviews, you find out things that they didn't think was particularly relevant, or something that they didn't necessarily want to disclose, but you're seeing things happening in practice. Mason says that it allows the full immersion within the research setting, and I think it really provides you with that wider context of the situation and in terms of the organisation that you're researching. So rather than just having one-on-one contact, which is very good in terms of interviews and you get lots of data from that, you're able to see beyond just the interview, see that person within the wider organisation, and actually see the whole context of which your project is based within. So again, it's about deepening and enriching the data, and it also, going back to when I was saying if you're using multiple research methods, drawing parallels and bringing that data together to make comparisons between your research findings. What we found really useful as a team is that observation allows access to information that is happening rapidly. So when I carried out my PhD, it was a big policy change whilst I was out in the field. So it was part of the latest NHS reforms. So it was fascinating, genuinely, to be out in the field whilst these masses of documents were being published from the Department of Health. And then I was looking at 3 different organisations who were trying to read these massive documents, interpret them, make sense of them locally, and actually that provided a whole new source of data. And in terms of my specific research question, it enabled me to see how that fitted in within the bigger picture and within the wider organisation itself. So you got that fast-paced data and really got to experience what was happening in practice. So, my PhD, I explored how clinical commissioning groups, CCGs, were tackling health inequalities. Just a small question. And my fieldwork took place for the duration of took place during 2012. So at the time, clinical commissioning groups weren't formal organisations. They were replacing primary care trusts, and they were trying to develop themselves as new organisations. And part of that process was a national authorisation process, which meant that each CCG had to produce a mass of documents. It was something like 20 criteria that they had to show their capabilities of that they could function as an organisation. And one of those included health inequalities, but it also included things like safeguarding. So at the time of my fieldwork, you can just, imagine just these having to try and produce this amount of documents when they're not even a formal organisation, and there's lots of change occurring. So there was a lot going on. And within that, CCGs were told that they had a duty to tackle health inequalities, but they weren't provided any guidance of how to do that, of how they should move forward. So again, in terms of observations, it was really interesting to see how that was being interpreted and discussed within their organisational settings. So my methods themselves mainly used interviews and observations, and like I said earlier, I also used collected documents that I thought were relevant. I know, again, I am talking about health, but these are just my experiences, but these types of research methods for whatever organisation you're looking at are very much transferable. So I'm sorry it is very much health-based in terms of my PhD. And for the rest of the talk, I really just want to talk about what I would class as my practical experiences and my top tips for carrying out observational research, and then just show you some of the data. So how does it work? In terms of organisational research, I think it's really important whatever organisation you're looking at, to try and understand the structure of that organisation, because that in itself impacts and sets you in a direction of where you need to be carrying out observations, what are relevant to your research project. So fortunately, in my area, CCGs tend to have these pretty organograms where you can see all the different meetings and the structures and the governance within them. That's not always that simple, but if you are fortunate enough to get hold of a document like that, you're able, in terms of your research questions, to identify useful meetings that you could attend in terms of where you think you'll be able to get relevant information. If you're not that lucky, which sometimes these things happen, it might just be ad hoc. You might have to go to the highest level of that organisation, the top meeting, and then try and figure and muddle your way through identifying meetings when they occur through interviews. But if possible, try and find an organisational structure. Once you've decided where you want to carry out your observations, you need to think about arranging those meetings. And it seems really, really simple, but you've already jumped through such hoops as ethical clearance, your research governance, you've got permission from the organisation to carry out your field work. But again, thinking about the organisation, you also need to think about, well, actually, who's chairing that meeting? Do they know who I am and why I am researching their organisation? So So if you've identified 5 different meetings that will be useful for you to attend or where you want to observe, you might potentially have 5 different chairs for those meetings, and it's useful for you to make contact with them in advance. Send them an email, this is what I'm doing, it's been approved by the head of the organisation, this is the research project, some information about it, and explain what it means about you carrying out observations. So for me, I'd send an email saying I won't actually impact upon your meeting, I'm just going to sit and watch what's happening, but just explaining your presence so you don't just present yourself to a meeting and get off on the wrong foot with those people. If they agree and say come along, at that point it's always useful to see if you can get added to the mailing list of those meetings. So can you have them send you through their agendas, the minutes of the last meeting, because that information is such a useful tool when carrying out observations and can really help you make sense of the meetings as you start to attend them. So it's fantastic. They said you can come, you're on the mailing list, come along and observe us, we're quite happy with that. So what happens on the day? When you arrive at the meeting, it's always really good and useful to go introduce yourself to the chair, say this is who I am, at last we get to speak face to face. And it seems like such trivial things, but those kinds of little moments between you and the organisation can make such a difference in terms of how you're accepted within the organisation and how they feel comfortable around you to be observing them. Because these meetings, obviously, it would feel particularly strange to know that someone sat there watching you. So it's just building that rapport, really, with the organisation that you're looking at. At that point, or before the meeting, it might be useful to say to the chair, is the potential to have a 5-minute slot at the beginning of the meeting, just where you can introduce yourself to everybody in the room, say why you're there, what you're looking at, because you've got to think if the chair said yes, there's still people in that room who might potentially not want to be observed, and they might ask you to leave. That has never happened to me in my experience, but in terms of when you're getting your ethical clearance and you're thinking about those types of things, they're just little things to have in the back of your mind to be aware of, really. It sounds really silly, but ask where they would like you to sit, because I looked at 3 CCGs, and where I sat within those meetings was different dependent upon each organisation of where they wanted you to sit, how they felt about you being in the room, and it's just about saving yourself any embarrassment if they ask you to leave the table or anything like that. It seems really silly, but we've got experience as a team where you will be asked to move potentially if you sit around in the wrong place. And that's fine, and as long as they are comfortable with where you are, you know that you're fine and you can just get on with what you're there to do, so to speak. And I think the most important thing really that I want to get across is observations themselves can be really challenging, and I don't think until you start carrying them out you really understand how they can really push you as a researcher and often move you beyond your own personal comfort zone. So such things as not sitting in the right place and being asked to move, or having attention drawn to you throughout a meeting. It's getting used to those things, but in terms of once you've got the experience and you get used to carrying out observations, the actual data that you get is really worthwhile, and it is rewarding. And the big one, I suppose, in terms of carrying out observations, is take comprehensive field notes throughout the meeting. And that sounds very easy to do, but there's different ways in which you will want to carry out your note-taking. And for me personally, again, it's my experiences, and what I do is I tend to find that when I attend a meeting, I find my slot where it's acceptable to sit within the organisation, and then on my notebook that I take, I draw an image of the layout of the room. So if there's a central table where the meeting's taking place, I draw that table and I try to write down as much as I possibly can about who's sat around the table. Now, on your first meeting, you're probably not going to know who anybody is bar the chair. Don't feel overwhelmed by that, that's normal. We've all, when you're carrying out these for the first time in a new organisation, you don't know who people are. It could be as simple as a man with blue tie, or those kinds of things, just to help as an aid for you to remember. In certain meetings, if you attend early, actually you get a name, they have name plaques if they're being held in public, and that helps. Another useful tool when you're drawing the dynamics of the room, just to help you as an aid, is use the agenda and the minutes from the last meeting that I said if you've managed to get hold of those, it will identify the people who were in attendance, and then when they're talking throughout the meeting, you'll be like, that's that person who's the quality lead. And it just helps bring things together, and I think it makes the process a little bit easier. Personally, in terms of taking my notes, I follow the agenda of the meeting that they set. So if they have minutes from the last meeting, I use all their subheadings that they use, because rather than looking for one specific thing, I try and take as much information that's happening as it is happening within that meeting and writing it down. At first it feels fraught, because I think we all talk quickly than we write, and you might feel like you're missing something, but actually the longer you do this, the more experience you have of carrying out this type of research method, actually the easier it becomes to say, well, that's not actually relevant, but they spoke about finance in this section, or different elements of the meeting. But by taking notes, you're able to, if you're following the agenda, it puts your mind in that place in terms of what's happening with the meeting for when you're going to be typing it up at a later date. And it also enables you to say, you know, if you notice that there's some tension in the meeting, well, that happened over this item in the agenda, and who was tense within that. So it just gives you the wider context of the organisation. So in terms of, that's how I do it in terms of writing down individual items and taking as much as possible down at the time. But it will get easier, is the main point from that, I think. So in terms of my actual notes, I couldn't bring any solid examples to put around the room, because I just thought confidentiality, it's quite obvious to really figure out who's who in terms of my sites. But personally, I like to try and type up my observation notes in the same meeting, in the same week that that meeting has occurred. I know that's not always that straightforward, and you're really, really busy. But in terms of typing them up, I find it useful that actually you might have missed something, or you remember something. It's clear in your mind if you're doing it within a quick time frame, that contextual, wider information. So when I type up my notes, at the top of every observation, I write what the meeting was, who attended. I even separate right down to the agenda items in terms of at what point they took place. And the reason I do that is some meetings are private, some meetings are public, and it just disseminates that in terms of, for me, separates it. I know what's happening. How frequently? I often write the location, but I've taken that out today. So you obviously couldn't identify the site. But again, I just think that helps in terms of you know what room you're in, and it helps when you're typing up your notes. And then at the end of every observation, as it's happened, when I leave that meeting, whether I'm sat on the train or I'm sat in the car before I drove home, I also like to reflect on the meeting that's happened and write down my thoughts, and they're included in my type-up of my notes. So in terms of my thoughts, it could be your particular research topic. Say for my PhD, they didn't talk about health inequalities at all, it wasn't on the agenda, but actually these things are much more important, and you can understand why it was nudged off of the agenda for those types of reasons. So it's just reflecting on the meeting. And your thoughts are useful in terms of when you go into your next stage of such things as analysis and generating codes and themes that you think you're seeing out in practice. Alongside typing up your notes, I also carry a research diary with me, which is a really useful tool I found when using multiple methods. So I take notes write down things that come to me as I'm in an observation. Oh, I missed that in an interview, maybe I should chase that up. And just generally, I think as a whole, when you come to doing your analysis, it enables you to have a bit of a story and a journey in terms of where you've been out in the field and your understanding of that particular organisation. Again, like I said, these are just my personal experiences of what I found useful. So, how can you use observational research, and what did I do for my PhD? So, because I wanted to see how CCGs were tackling health inequalities, I thought in the initial stages it'd be really important to try and understand how they actually thought about them, how did they define them. So, what are health inequalities for these organisations? So I carried out interviews with individuals, GPs, managers, public health consultants. And this is just an example of this. So the first quote is from an interview with a public health consultant in my second site, when I said, you know, what do you think health inequalities are? What do they mean to you? And they said, well, I think you need to divide between inequalities in terms of access to healthcare and inequalities in terms of outcome. And I think most people, when they're talking about inequalities, are looking at geographical inequalities. So, for example, as I've described for Area 1, Area 2 problem, where we've got a stark difference in the terms of life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, probably being 10 to 12 years different in those two areas. So that people living in those areas don't have equal chance to good health. And throughout all my interviews with these very different professionals, this is how, within this site, they were talking about health inequalities. So these geographical differences in health. I thought that's great. They seem to have a consistent story in terms of how they're interpreting it as individuals and as an organisation. So what I then did is I was carrying out my observations in parallel to my interviews, as I wanted to see if that interpretation and understanding was actually being put into practice, being discussed within the wider context of the organisation. And the two quotes below, again from the public health consultant, are examples of where health inequalities were spoken about within organisational meetings and within the same conceptualisation framework as what was spoken about in interviews. So, public health consultant here at the governing body said, we know that working in different localities will need different work, as we know there is a disparity between Area 1 and Area 2 in health-seeking behaviours. We have tried to develop a strategy that includes everyone's day jobs. So what I found quite interesting when I was carrying out my observations is you could see, yep, this is how we think about it, this is how I've spoken about it on an individual. We are aware of this, and because this is how we understand them, we need to think about how we disseminate that further and how we tackle them. So I could see the story of not just having this is what we're doing, I could see how they were trying to implement their thoughts into practice. And again, they were talking in the annual planning event about health inequalities and issues with practices in deprived areas versus non-deprived areas and their need in terms of what they needed from the CCG for tackling health inequalities. So really this is just a slide to show how I was able in my thesis to use different methods and different types of data to illustrate a point. And it shows how I set it out within my thesis was this is what people are saying and this is what's happening in practice. So it was supporting what people were saying to me on an individual level. So the big question was how are CCGs tackling health inequalities? And in all honesty, because of the timing of my project, they weren't really tackling health inequalities because they couldn't be, because they had so much to be dealing with. But I wanted to know about that. That was my research question. That was what I was trying to find out. So this is from Site 3, which was a very interesting site because it was quite clear they didn't really have an organisational understanding of health inequalities. And so from that, they didn't know how they were going to tackle them or what they were going to do about it. And in terms of the authorisation process that I spoke about earlier, they got a red cross against their names in terms of the health inequalities agenda when they were trying to become a fully functioning organisation. So the top quote here is from a GP who was the health inequalities lead for the CCG. And what was really interesting is when I asked them how you're tackling health inequalities, I think probably the rehearsed answer would have to be the pain tender. The pain service tender, which I mean was certainly a joint strategic needs assessment priority. The number of people living in chronic pain and the lack of holistic service to deal with that. So there's a service tender gone out, I think. Well, the contract's been awarded. I guess the service has been mobilised now. I think that's the most tangible example. And then there was a pause, and then it was, we fell down. We didn't fall down. That was our missing information for the authorisation day. So I'm not surprised I don't have a coherent answer. So from carrying out interviews, it was really clear that actually everybody gave this answer. And they all said this is how we're tackling health inequalities. But actually the health inequalities lead said let's be realistic in this interview. We don't really know. And was quite happy to share that information post-authorisation. In terms of observations, I very early on realised that they hadn't really thought about health inequalities or what that meant for them as an organisation. So these are just examples of what happened when I was observing these meetings is absolutely anything they thought that was related to health inequalities, they felt the need to point it out to me, just in case they were ticking that box. So I'd be sat in the corner taking my notes, and then here you can see from a GP We had a really good equality impact assessment, see here, and he was sat with his back to me, and he turned around in the whole meeting and was pointing frantically at this piece of paper to tell me that they were thinking about health inequalities. And everyone found it highly amusing. And then also in another meeting, GP12, just for Lynsey, an equality and impact assessment was carried out. So anything that they thought related to health inequalities, they'd just try and throw it my way, as in, we are thinking about it, write good things about us. Which again drew this picture that they didn't really have an organisational understanding of the issue or any idea of how they were going to move forward and tackle it. But why I brought this today to show you is, I think it's an example of when I spoke about earlier about non-participant observations, of how you can get drawn into meetings. And this is the whole point about when you're carrying out observations, be reflexive, think about your what you being in the room might mean to them as an organisation. And I must say, in terms of the things that they were talking about that were happening on the agenda, I didn't change that at all. That meeting was set in place, but it did become a little bit of a joke throughout the latter months of my fieldwork to point out anything to me and for everybody to find it very funny, just to embarrass me as much as they could. So you have to just think about that, and I had a whole section in my thesis thinking about, you know, what impact did I have upon that situation. They got thought about tackling health inequality, so I not made a difference in that sense, and it was quite amusing. But it brings you back to that being pushed beyond your comfort zone, and when there's 20 people around a table and you're sat on your own, for me, just be ready to blush was pretty much my interpretation of that. So what I did here is I used observations to try and prove my point of actually they weren't talking about it, and anything they did think, they just point out to me to try and tick that box. And my final example from my PhD is looking at the role of public health. Now, what was quite interesting is this is not something I'd thought about in terms of my research project at all. At the time, public health was moving out of healthcare back into the local authority, and I had a colleague at the time who was looking more at the local authority and health inequalities. So I thought mine would be quite clinical based, and I wouldn't be thinking about this kind of dynamic. But across the 3 CCGs, I found that the interactions and relationship with their public health teams was quite different. And I found a typology really for different types of public health working. So how they develop their relationships could be a service provider, co-ownership of the public health agenda, or a critical friend. That was very, very different, and very clear to see those differences by using observations with the way that they were interacting with public health, or how the public health consultant felt in terms of speaking. So when talking to this public health consultant, which was quite early on, it was one of my earlier interviews, I said, you know, can you talk to me about what the role of public health is within the CCG, what your role is, what do you do? And this public health consultant said, I suppose if push came to shove, I wouldn't have voting rights. So they know they work for the local authority for a different organisation. But I've always felt that I'm able to say what I want to say or comment on things. And I know in some areas, the people that are in attendance don't even sit at the big table. Sometimes they're allowed to say things and so on, but actually being welcomed at the table makes a big difference, I think, to your feeling about being included and part of the agenda. So from that interview, I took that actually the public health relationship with the CCG, they don't have a voting right, but they're able to be vocal and bring across their point where they think it's necessary to support the CCG and build those relationships. And because I did the 12 months of fieldwork, and because of the health reforms, things were rapidly changing. So originally, CCG meetings, while they were forming themselves, were being held in private because they were trying to figure out who was going to be sitting around the table, who would have voting rights. And as time went on, it became clear that CCGs would have to hold their meetings in public, so members of the public could come along and listen to what they said. So at that point is when it got interesting, because if I'd have just taken that quote and left it, I would have really thought that, yes, they seem to have a good working relationship, and the public health consultant is happy with that. However, once this particular site started to hold their meetings in public, the public health consultant got moved to the cheap seats with the rest of the members of the public. And actually that whole dynamic of the organisation and how they were public-facing changed how they sat as an organisation and who they wanted, how they wanted to be perceived, who was sat around that table. This is the organisation. So although it's not in terms of I don't have a quote, it was my experience in the wider context of using observational research which allowed me to look at the different dynamics of relationships and working practices. And it showed actually how over time, as the reform went ahead, that relationships changed and working dynamics changed, which again, in turn for my research project, could potentially impact upon the health and equalities agenda. So that's really all I wanted to talk about today in terms of just the practical side of things. There's just a few references there, and if you are interested in my PhD, I have written my methodology up for SAGE, which talks about the use of using different methods together, and how my project came together in the end.